Picture this. It's the year 1400, and you're standing on a ridge in what we now call Arizona. The sun is just beginning to paint the desert floor in shades of gold and crimson, and below you, something extraordinary is happening. Apache women are moving through the landscape with a precision that would make a modern logistics coordinator weep with envy. They know every plant, every seasonal cycle, every hidden water source across thousands of square miles of what most people would consider uninhabitable wasteland. But here's the thing that'll blow your mind. This isn't just survival. This is economic mastery of the highest order. These women aren't just gathering food. They're managing a complex resource extraction operation that spans multiple ecosystems. When the century plant, the agave, flowers once in its 15-year lifetime, Apache women know exactly when and where. They're there with specialized tools, harvesting the sugar-rich hearts that will feed entire bands through the lean months. Mesquite beans, prickly pear fruits, acorns from the mountain oaks, each resource mapped, each season planned with military precision. And speaking of military precision, while the women orchestrate this desert symphony of survival, the men are preparing for something that would reshape the entire Southwest. War isn't just coming, war is already here. Small bands of Apache warriors, maybe 30 to 50 people total, are developing tactics that would make special forces operators today nod in appreciation. They can scatter like smoke when threatened, each person knowing exactly where to rendezvous, exactly which hidden cache contains the weapons and supplies they need. Now here's where it gets really interesting. In Apache society, women aren't just along for the ride. They own property. They have voices in the crucial decisions about when to move, when to fight, when to negotiate. This isn't some romantic, noble, savage nonsense. This is hardcore political and economic reality. When a band needs to decide whether to risk a raid or relocate to winter grounds, the women who manage the logistics, who know every waterhole within 5 days' ride, who understand the seasonal availability of resources, their input isn't just welcomed, it's essential. But then in 1680, everything changes. Spanish horses arrive in the Southwest, and within a single generation, think about that, just 20 years, Apache warriors become the finest light cavalry on the North American continent. We're talking about a transformation that would be like modern farmers becoming Formula One drivers in the span of a college education. These are people who had been walking everywhere for centuries, suddenly mastering an entirely new technology of warfare and mobility. And the women, they adapt too, because adaptation is what Apache culture does better than perhaps any society in human history. They develop new preservation techniques for the grains captured in raids. They learn to manage camps, swollen not just with their own families, but with livestock stolen from Spanish settlements and captives taken in war. The careful desert economy expands into something much more complex and dynamic. Imagine trying to coordinate the movements of hundreds of horses while maintaining your traditional seasonal rounds through territories that might span what we'd consider 3 modern states. Picture managing supply chains that now include not just desert plants and mountain game, but Spanish wheat, Mexican silver, and human captives who need to be integrated into Apache society. The logistical challenges would break most modern supply chain managers, but Apache women made it look routine. The economic genius of this system is breathtaking. Small bands of 30 to 50 people can scatter across thousands of square miles, becoming essentially invisible to their enemies. But when opportunity strikes or danger threatens, they can coalesce into forces of hundreds of warriors seemingly overnight. It's guerrilla warfare perfected, but it only works because of the women maintaining those hidden supply caches, knowing every spring and seep, every defensible position and escape route across vast territories. The trade networks these people develop stretch from the pueblos of New Mexico to the mining towns of northern Mexico. Apache bands become the middlemen controlling the flow of horses north, weapons south, and captives in every direction. They're not just raiders, they're the Amazon.com of the 18th century Southwest. If Amazon delivered exclusively at spear point, by 1800, names like Mangus Coloradas, Red Sleeves, echo across the desert like thunder. These leaders forged loose confederations of Apache bands while maintaining the autonomy that makes Apache resistance so devastatingly effective. Mangus Coloradas stands 6.5 feet tall in an era when most men barely reach 5.5 feet. He's a giant in every sense, commanding respect not through inherited titles, but through proven ability to coordinate these scattered bands into a force that can challenge empires. Because that's what we're really talking about here. This isn't random violence or primitive warfare. This is calculated economic warfare designed to control resources and maintain territorial dominance against all competitors. The Apache understand something that takes modern counterinsurgency experts years of training to grasp. That controlling territory isn't about holding ground. It's about controlling the people and resources within that territory. The Spanish learn this the hard way. The Mexicans will learn it even harder. But there's a new power rising in the east, one that's going to bring industrial warfare to the desert Southwest. One that's going to test Apache adaptation and Apache women's genius for survival in ways that will shake the very foundations of their world. And when these two forces collide, in the middle of the 19th century, the resulting explosion will echo through the desert for generations to come. Everything changed on February 2nd, 1848. Not immediately, you understand. History rarely works that way. But on that day, when Mexican and American diplomats signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in a small town most people couldn't find on a map, they casually transferred Apache homelands to United States control with the stroke of a pen. Imagine someone selling your house while you're living in it, without asking your permission, without even bothering to tell you. That's essentially what happened to every Apache band from the Rio Grande to the Colorado River. The Apache had been fighting the Spanish for 2 centuries. 200 years of warfare, raid and counter-raid, accommodation and betrayal. They'd learned Spanish tactics, Spanish weaknesses, Spanish patterns. When Mexico gained independence in 1821, the Apache simply shifted gears and continued the same deadly dance with new opponents. Mexican scalp hunters like James Kirker offered bounties, 200 pesos for a warrior's scalp, 100 for a woman's, 50 for a child's. The Apache responded by perfecting raids that could strike a settlement, capture supplies and livestock, and vanish before organized pursuit could form. But these new invaders, these Americans, brought something different to the desert. Industrial warfare, where Spanish and Mexican forces might field a few hundred soldiers with outdated muskets. The Americans could deploy thousands of troops with rifled weapons, mobile artillery and telegraph communications. They built forts not as isolated outposts, but as links in a chain designed to control entire territories. Most terrifying of all, they brought settlers, not just soldiers and missionaries, but families intent on permanent occupation of Apache lands. The betrayal that ignited 25 years of the most savage warfare in American history happened at Apache Pass in February 1861. Think about the psychology of this moment. Cochise, one of the most respected Apache leaders, had been maintaining peaceful relations with the Americans. His band regularly traded with the stage station at Apache Pass, providing wood and safe passage in exchange for supplies. It was exactly the kind of accommodation that had allowed Apache bands to coexist with Spanish and Mexican authorities for generations. Lieutenant George Bascom, fresh from West Point and absolutely convinced of his own superiority, decided Cochise was lying about a recent raid. During what Cochise believed was a peaceful parley, Bascom seized the Apache leader's brother and 2 nephews as hostages. The cultural misunderstanding was complete and devastating. In Apache society, seizing relatives during a peaceful meeting wasn't just betrayal, it was a violation of everything that made civilization possible. Cochise escaped, But the damage was irreversible. He retreated to his stronghold in the Dragoon Mountains, those towering granite spires that rise like ancient cathedrals from the desert floor. From there, he launched a campaign of vengeance that left hundreds of Americans and Mexican civilians dead across Arizona territory. The man who had been a potential ally became the most feared Apache war leader in the Southwest. But here's what really gets to me about this period: the Apache women and children caught in the middle of this escalating nightmare. They huddled in remote rancherias, always ready to flee at the first sign of cavalry dust clouds on the horizon. These were women who had mastered the art of survival in one of North America's harshest environments. But now they had to add a new skill: invisibility. They learned to cook without smoke, to move camps without leaving tracks, to cache supplies in places where even other Apache might not find them. The massacre at Camp Grant on April 30th, 1871, forever poisoned any possibility of trust between Americans and Apache. Picture this scene because it's crucial to understanding everything that follows. Over 100 Apache women and children had surrendered to the military at Camp Grant. They were living peacefully near the fort, under what they believed was military protection. The women were learning to grind wheat instead of mesquite beans. Children were playing games with wooden toys carved by American soldiers. At dawn on that April morning, a mob of Tucson citizens, including prominent businessmen and community leaders, surrounded the sleeping Apache camp. What followed was methodical slaughter. Babies were torn from their mothers' arms and their skulls crushed with stones. Women were shot, stabbed, and clubbed to death while trying to protect their children. Only 8 Apaches survived the massacre, all of them young girls who were taken as slaves. Apache mothers who survived would never forget how they had been lured by promises of protection, only to see their families butchered. The psychological warfare was as devastating as the physical violence. How could Apache women ever trust American promises again? How could they believe that surrender offered anything but death? General George Crook arrived in Arizona Territory in 1872 with a new strategy that exploited Apache society's greatest strength and turned it into a weakness. Instead of trying to fight Apache bands with conventional forces, Crook recruited Apache scouts to hunt their own people. This wasn't just military genius. This was psychological warfare at its most sophisticated. Crook understood that Apache bands had ancient rivalries, that not all Apache peoples had identical interests, that individuals might choose American rations over starvation in the mountains. The economic warfare intensified beyond anything the Apache had faced before. American soldiers didn't just chase war parties. They systematically destroyed the resource base that made Apache resistance possible. They burned rancherias, killed game animals, and most devastatingly of all, they destroyed the agave plants that Apache women depended on for survival. Remember, these plants take 15 years to mature. Destroying an agave field was like burning down a 15-year food supply. By 1885, the arithmetic of survival had become impossible for all but one Apache leader. Geronimo remained free with his band of 38 people, men, women, and children. They moved like ghosts across the international border between Arizona and Mexico, raiding for supplies while evading 5,000 American troops and 3,000 Mexican soldiers. 8,000 soldiers hunting 38 Apache. Think about those odds for a moment. Lieutenant Charles Gatewood, one of the few American officers who had learned Apache language and customs, finally convinced Geronimo to meet with General Nelson Miles in September 1886. The terms seemed honorable. Geronimo's band would reunite with their families already imprisoned in Florida. They would receive good treatment, and after a brief exile, they would be allowed to return to their homeland. It was a lie that would haunt American military honor for generations. But Geronimo's people were exhausted, their children starving, and winter was coming to the mountains. Sometimes, even the greatest warriors must choose between death with honor and the possibility that their children might somehow survive. On September 8, 1886, at Fort Bowie in Arizona Territory, Apache women sat in the dust with their children. Certain death awaited them. Let me paint you this picture, because the psychological weight of this moment is staggering. These weren't just any Apache women. These were the survivors, the ones who had endured decades of warfare that had claimed brothers, fathers, husbands, sons. Women who had fled through desert nights, carrying babies on their backs, while cavalry thundered behind them. Women who had seen relatives massacred at Camp Grant, who had watched their men die fighting impossible odds against industrial warfare, who had buried children claimed by starvation and disease in hidden mountain camps. They knew what happened to captured enemies. The Apache had their own traditions of dealing with prisoners, and they assumed Americans followed similar practices. Torture, perhaps. Starvation, certainly. Slavery for the children who survived. In their experience, surrender meant prolonging death, not preventing it. The children pressed against their mothers, sensing the fear that radiated from women who had never before been truly helpless. These were mothers who could find water in rocks, who could make nutritious meals from desert plants most people would never recognize as food, who could read weather patterns and animal behavior to predict danger days in advance. But now they sat in the dust of an American fort, their traditional knowledge useless, their fighting men either dead or disarmed, waiting for the final cruelty that would end their resistance forever. Then came the soldiers, the same blue-coated enemies who had hunted them through the mountains, who had burned their camps and killed their relatives. The women pulled their children closer, whispering final prayers in Apache, preparing for whatever horror was about to unfold. But instead of weapons, the soldiers carried wooden crates and canvas sacks. The Apache women watched in stunned confusion as American soldiers began distributing food. Not the spoiled meat and weevil-infested flour that they'd heard was sometimes given to reservation Apache. Actual military rations. Strips of fatty bacon, the same salt pork that American soldiers ate on campaign. Sacks of white wheat flour, heavy and fine-milled. Tins of coffee, the bitter black drink that Americans seemed to need for survival. One elderly woman, speaking years later to an ethnographer, said she thought it must be poison, a final cruel trick. Why else would enemies feed people they intended to kill? The psychological dissonance was overwhelming. These women had been taught from childhood that Americans were devils who killed Apache babies for sport. Their entire worldview, shaped by 25 years of escalating warfare and broken promises, could not accommodate this simple act of feeding hungry people. But the soldiers demonstrated. They built fires, fried the bacon in cast-iron pans, the smell of cooking meat filling the air with an aroma that made children's stomachs clench with hunger they'd been forced to ignore. They showed how to mix flour with water and a pinch of salt to make simple bread. Most shocking of all, they gave the same rations to Apache families that American soldiers received, not lesser food, not rotten supplies, but actual military provisions. Watch the faces of these Apache mothers as they processed this information. For months, some for years, they had kept their children alive on desert plants, small game when they could catch it, and whatever supplies could be captured in raids. Now American soldiers were offering food freely, without demands, without conditions. The children were starving. You could see their ribs, count the vertebrae beneath their thin skin. Mother love warred with warrior pride, and mother love won. Some women wept as they watched their children eat, torn between relief and a deep spiritual confusion that shook the foundations of their understanding. In Apache culture, sharing food created bonds of obligation. Food wasn't just nutrition, it was relationship, responsibility, connection. How could they accept food from enemies whose hands were stained with Apache blood? How could they feed their children with supplies that might have been bought with bounties paid for Apache scalps? Yet they did. Each bite of that strange, pale bread, each strip of salty bacon their children chewed, represented a small surrender to an incomprehensible new reality. The children ate with desperate hunger, but their mothers watched with expressions that mixed gratitude, confusion, and profound loss. They were witnessing the end of their old world, But they couldn't yet understand what kind of new world was beginning. The psychological impact went deeper than immediate survival. These women were the keepers of Apache oral tradition, the ones who remembered the creation stories, who taught children the proper prayers for hunting and gathering, who maintained the complex kinship relationships that held Apache society together. They had raised their children on stories of American treachery and cruelty, prepared them for a world where white faces meant death. Now those same white faces were feeding starving Apache babies. Think about the impossible position this created. How do you explain to a 5-year-old child that the soldiers giving him bread are the same people who killed his father? How do you maintain cultural identity while accepting help from the enemy? How do you prepare children for a future you cannot imagine, in a world where all your previous assumptions have been shattered? Some of the women began to sing quietly under their breath, not war songs or mourning songs, but the ancient Apache songs for times of transition, for moments when the world shifted in ways that human understanding couldn't immediately grasp. These were songs that acknowledged that some changes were too large for immediate comprehension, that sometimes survival required accepting help from incomprehensible sources. The children fell asleep with full bellies for the first time in months. Their mothers sat awake through the night, watching American sentries pace the fort's perimeter, trying to understand what kind of captivity this would be. They had prepared for death, for torture, for separation from their children. They had not prepared for kindness. And kindness from enemies was the most dangerous thing of all, because kindness implied a future. Kindness suggested that survival might be possible. And if survival was possible, then these Apache mothers would need to find ways to keep their culture alive in a world they did not understand. Among people they had every reason to distrust. For children whose futures would be unlike anything Apache generations had ever faced before. The train journey to Florida lasted 8 days in suffocating wooden cars that had been designed to transport cattle, not families. Apache women tried to comfort children who had never been confined, who had lived their entire lives under the vast sky of the Southwest desert. Imagine being born in a land where you can see for 50 miles in any direction, where the horizon stretches endlessly, and then being locked in a wooden box that bounces and lurches for over a week toward a destination you cannot imagine. Fort Marion in St. Augustine became their prison, a stone fortress built by the Spanish centuries earlier to guard against pirates and enemies from the sea. For people who had measured time by the flowering of desert plants and the migration of animals, the humid air of Florida felt like drowning. The Apache had evolved over centuries to thrive in an environment where every drop of moisture was precious. Now they found themselves in a swamp where water fell from the sky with tropical violence, and the air itself seemed thick enough to drink. Within months, tuberculosis began claiming lives. The warrior Chihuahua, who had survived countless battles and raids, watched 3 of his children die in a single week from diseases their desert-adapted immune systems had never encountered. The government's promise to reunite Geronimo's band with their families proved to be another lie in a long catalogue of American deceptions. Geronimo and his closest followers were kept in separate confinement, and within 2 years, the cruelest blow of all fell. The children over 12 were seized and sent to Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania. Think about what this meant to Apache mothers who had already lost everything else. In Apache society, children weren't just the future, they were the living repository of cultural knowledge. Apache mothers taught daughters the complex prayers for their coming-of-age ceremonies, showed them how to identify and prepare hundreds of different plants, passed down the intricate kinship relationships that governed Apache social organization. Sons learned from their mothers the sacred stories that connected Apache people to their homeland, the proper relationships between humans and the natural world. At Carlisle, these children had their hair cut and their names changed. They were forbidden to speak Apache on pain of beating. They were forced into military-style uniforms and taught that everything their parents had ever taught them was primitive superstition. Many would die there, buried in the school cemetery under Christian headstones that bore American, names their grandparents would never recognize. But here's where the story takes a turn that will make you believe in the power of human resilience. In the damp barracks of Fort Marion, then Mount Vernon Barracks in Alabama, where they were moved in 1887, then finally Fort Sill in Oklahoma in 1894. Apache women became the secret guardians of their culture. They couldn't prevent the children from being taken. They couldn't stop the diseases or the forced relocations. But they could whisper. Late at night, when American guards dozed or walked their rounds, Apache grandmothers whispered the creation stories to children young enough to avoid the boarding schools. They taught songs in voices so low they could barely be heard above the breathing of sleeping families. They found ways to maintain kinship bonds despite forced separations, creating extended family networks that crossed state lines and reservation boundaries. The Apache remained prisoners of war until 1913. 27 years of captivity. Think about that number. 27 years. The longest imprisonment of any group in American history. Children who had been born free in the mountains grew into adults who had never seen the desert their parents described in whispered stories. Yet somehow, incredibly, Apache culture survived. When finally released, some chose to return to reservations in New Mexico and Arizona. Others remained in Oklahoma, where they had built new communities and new lives. The women who had once gathered desert plants now learned farming and wage labor, but they never forgot the old ways. They adapted, the way Apache people had always adapted, finding ways to honor tradition while embracing necessary change. Their granddaughters would grow up to lead language revitalization programs, bringing Apache words back to classrooms, where children learned to speak the language their great-grandmothers had whispered in prison barracks. These women became teachers, nurses, lawyers, business leaders. They learned to navigate two worlds with the same skill their ancestors had shown navigating desert survival. And here's the part that will blow your mind. Today, Apache nations generate over $2 billion annually from gaming enterprises, tourism, timber operations, and other businesses. $2 billion. The same strategic intelligence that once dominated the Southwest through military campaigns now builds prosperity through economic sovereignty. The same ability to adapt quickly to changing circumstances that made Apache warriors legendary now makes Apache entrepreneurs formidable competitors in modern markets. In the boardrooms of successful Apache corporations, portraits of Geronimo and Cochise remind everyone that the same qualities that enabled survival against impossible odds, adaptability, strategic thinking, fierce independence, and absolute loyalty to family and community, now drive success in contemporary business. The descendants of women who once hid supply caches in desert mountains now manage investment portfolios and development projects. The bacon and bread that once symbolized surrender and confusion at Fort Bowie has been replaced by economic independence and cultural pride. Apache children today grow up bilingual, equally comfortable in traditional ceremonies and contemporary classrooms. They learn the old stories and the new possibilities, understanding that survival requires both honoring the past and embracing change. The women who sat in the dust at Fort Bowie in 1886, certain they were witnessing the end of Apache civilization, could never have imagined that their great-great-granddaughters would become college presidents, federal judges, and corporate executives while still maintaining traditional Apache values and ceremonies. They could never have envisioned Apache language programs in modern schools, or Apache artists whose work hangs in museums worldwide, or Apache scientists studying climate change in the very deserts their ancestors knew so intimately. The story that began with what seemed like final defeat ends with renaissance. The spirit that could survive in the harshest desert, that could adapt from walking to horseback warfare in a generation, that could maintain cultural identity through 27 years of imprisonment, has proven once again that some forces in this world are truly unconquerable. The thunder that once echoed through desert canyons now resonates through modern success stories. Proof that the Apache understanding of survival, adaptation, and resilience remains as relevant today as it was when their ancestors first learned to find water in stones and life in the most unforgiving landscape on Earth.